The Canon M50 is one of the most amazing cameras for beginners on the market. And in this video, I'm going to give you some clever tips and tricks to get you started and teach you beginner photography with this camera. This tutorial is going to cover over 95% of your photography with this camera. And the best part is, it's really easy. So let's begin. Most of the features and options I'm going to cover in this video cannot be done when you're in auto mode. For the purpose of this video, let's switch our camera to aperture value. On the top of your camera, you're going to see the mode dial. Let's switch this to AV. This stands for aperture value. This is a semi-programmable mode that we're going to cover later on in the class. You're probably already aware of this, but your camera does have a pull-out screen. But what I did not know was, until recently, is that you can flip the screen and have it placed in the back of the camera. In some cases, this is much easier to use. Once you're in one of the programmable modes, you can now use the articulating screen on the back of the camera. If you need to change a setting, you can just touch the screen on the setting you wish to adjust. And then when you're done, you can press the arrow on the top right-hand corner. By default, the Canon M50 is set to live view. But if you place the camera to your face, the sensor on the back of the camera will detect this and automatically switch to viewfinder. If you don't like using live view, there's an option to turn this off in the menu, but there is an easier way to do this. On the back of your camera, there's a button that says Info. Every time you press the Info button, the back of your screen is going to look different. There's a histogram, there's a minimalist screen, and there's your camera settings. Once you set your camera just to show the camera settings, you can now only use the viewfinder to take pictures. And of course, you can hit the Info button one more time to go back to the default screen. Once you get started with the Canon M50, there are a few camera features that you should learn right now. The first thing you should learn is how to reset your camera back to factory settings. If you ever come across a time when you mess something up, but you don't know what you did, try troubleshooting the problem yourself. But if it becomes evident you can't, just simply reset your camera back to factory settings. To do this, press the menu button. Then this screen should show up. Scroll over to where it says Function Settings. Then hit the Q button in the center of the camera. Once you get to this section, scroll over to page 5 and look for the option that says Clear Settings. Once you press this button and then confirm it again by hitting Clear All Camera Settings, this will put your camera settings back to how they were when you bought the camera. It won't, however, delete the pictures on your camera. On the Canon M50, in order to take an exposure, you just press the shutter button. However, you do have the option to use the touch screen to fire an exposure. Look for this icon on the back of the camera. Every time you press this, you're going to have a different option. There's Touch Shutter Disable, Touch Shutter Enable. Once you have this enabled, you can fire an exposure by touching the screen where you want to focus, and the camera is going to take a picture for you. You should also learn how to format your memory card in camera. When you format the card in camera, you're optimizing the card for this camera. This will result in a faster memory card and less likely to have memory card failure. To format your card, press the menu button again. Then scroll back over to Function Settings. Once you're in the Function Settings menu, on the very first page, option number 4 is Format Card. When you press this and then hit OK to confirm, your camera is going to format your card and delete all the pictures that were on here. So once you've safely downloaded your pictures onto your computer or device, put your memory card back into your camera and format it here. The Canon M50 has a shortcut menu to some of the more popular settings on your camera, which we're going to cover some of them in this video. To access the shortcut menu, press the Q button on the back of your camera. Now you're going to see this submenu. On the left and right hand side, you're going to see a whole bunch of different options. There's autofocus method, autofocus operation, and so on. To scroll through the different options, use your directional pad and go up or down. And if you keep pressing the down arrow, eventually you're going to be able to access the options on the right hand side of the camera. Then once you find a setting that you want to change, use the left or right arrow on your directional pad to select what option you want to use. And then when you're done here, hit the Q button again to set it. The first option you want to be aware of on this page is the image quality. On the left-hand side, the fifth option is called image quality. So let's scroll down here by using the directional pad to go up or down. Then once you're here, you're going to see a whole bunch of options. By default, you're on the highest quality JPEG, and for most people, this should be fine. I use the highest quality JPEG for most of my photography, but some people like to shoot in RAW format. RAW format is a higher quality image, but it's also 3 times larger. And you're going to need a program to edit RAW files. So if you are one of those folks who like to shoot in RAW, use your finger and the touch screen and select the RAW option. But if you prefer shooting in JPEG like I do most of the time, just go ahead and leave this in the highest quality JPEG. If you're going to be shooting sporting events, children, or pets, you may also want to use a feature called continuous mode. Right now your camera is set up when you press the shutter button, the camera is going to fire off one image. When you use continuous mode, you can fire a whole series of images in 1 second. On your camera, press the Q button. The third option is called drive mode. Once you press it, this submenu will show up. There's single shooting, there's high speed continuous, and there's low speed continuous. If you want to shoot something moving fast, let's choose high speed continuous and then press the Q button. Now when you press the shutter button, your camera is going to fire off a whole series of images. The continuous low is just a slower version of continuous high. On this submenu, this is also where you can find your self-timer options. Once you have taken a picture, you can press the play button on the back of your camera to see what you've done. And then you can use the directional pad to scroll through all the different images. But you can also use your finger to swipe the screen to go through all the pictures. And if you want to magnify the screen to see some details, double tap an area on your picture that you want to see. Now your screen's going to magnify 10 times. And you can use your finger to scroll around different areas of the picture. To get back to the normal screen, just double tap again. As a beginner, you can use auto ISO with the Canon M50. I consider ISO to be level 2 photography. That's something you learn once you got a handle on everything I've taught in this class. For some reason, most of the problems and frustrations for beginner photography is rooted in wrong ISO settings. So to make sure your camera is in auto ISO, press this area on the bottom right hand corner where it says ISO. By default, you should already be on auto. But if you ever need to change your ISO, this is the screen where you do it. And then when you're done, just press the arrow on the top right hand corner of the screen. The Canon M50 has an amazingly easy autofocus system, and you're going to love it. The way the camera is set up now is on tracking. Your camera is going to do a very good job of trying to detect faces in particular. And then when it does find a face, your camera is going to do its best to track it. If you're trying to shoot something and the camera does not automatically detect your subject, like a cat or a dog, you can also use your finger and touch the area on the back of the camera that you want your camera to track. Even if your subject moves or you start moving the camera around, it should still track the subject. There is also an option called eye detection, and it works really good most of the time. To turn on eye detection, let's press the menu button. When we get to this screen, we want to use the shooting settings option. Now this submenu should come up. On page 6, the fourth option is called eye detection AF. Let's set this to enable. Once you have this enabled, the camera is going to try to detect eyes and make sure it stays focused on that. It works great with humans, but it didn't work very good with cats. So now when you want to focus on something, all you have to do is touch your shutter button halfway down. The camera is going to lock and focus somewhere. If you don't like the area where the camera is focusing, use the touch screen to find the area. This way you can focus on stuff when there's foreground subject that gets in the way. You can shoot through some tree branches. There are some more advanced options that you can learn later. This will cover most of your photography. Now you are ready for Aperture mode. This is going to be your new favorite mode. It's the bridge between auto mode and full manual. We've already placed our camera in Aperture mode. That's where it says AV on your mode dial. In Aperture mode, you're going to be setting the camera's aperture, and your camera is going to choose the shutter speed for you. More than 95% of your daytime photography will be shot in Aperture mode for most people. It's also the mode that I use the most. Aperture is also 1/3 of the exposure triangle. And in this case, it's regulated by the lens. When you shoot in what's called a wide aperture, You're opening up the iris in your lens the widest. This lets in the most amount of light. When you shoot in a narrow aperture, you're restricting light through the iris. Aperture also controls the depth of field, which we're going to cover in a minute. So now that you're in aperture mode, you're going to notice this value on the back of your camera. These are called f-stops. The lower the f-stop value, the wider the aperture. With the kit lens that comes with the Canon M50, the widest aperture is going to be an f-stop value of 3.5. To change your aperture, spin your command dial. And to get the widest aperture, you're going to have to make sure your lens is wide open. So if you're going to be shooting in a dark area or it's cloudy out, you're going to want to shoot in a wide aperture. So when I'm in places like this, I put my camera in aperture mode and I use the lowest f-stop value I can. I love shooting in dark places like foggy days, cloudy days, back alleys. That's why I shoot with a wide aperture most of the time. And because I'm using auto ISO, I'm only setting the aperture and the camera's choosing the shutter speed and ISO for me. There are some other lenses on the market that have an even wider aperture. You can let in 4 times more light with some of these lenses. That's why night photographers spend so much money to get a lens like that. It's 3.5 when it's open, and then if you spin your command dial to the right, you'll be able to get all the way to f22. That means the iris in your lens is really restricting light. If you zoom your lens in all the way, the widest f-stop value you're going to be able to choose is 6.3. So let's zoom our lens in. Now let's spin our command dial all the way to the left until you see an f-stop value of 6.3. This is also where you're going to start controlling depth of field. When you zoom your lens in and shoot in a wide aperture, you can create shallow depth of field. This is how you get the bokeh effect with the blurred backgrounds. So if you're going to be taking portraits, for example, you're going to want to zoom your lens in, choose a wide aperture to start firing off your images. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. This subject is about 3 feet in front of me. I'm zoomed in with a wide aperture. If I change the aperture to something in the middle like f11, there's less blur. If I take this photo at f22, there's no more depth of field. You're going to get a flat image. That's why a lot of portrait photographers get these prime lenses. A prime lens has no zoom. If you get one of these 22, 30, or 50 millimeter prime lenses with an aperture value of 2, you're going to let in a lot more light into your camera and get a really beautiful bokeh effect. But these do cost more. I'll put a link to 3 different lenses in the description below. So here's the same example when you start using an aperture value of 2. Let's compare that to an aperture value of 6.3. There's a lot more depth of field with a prime lens, but it works just fine with the kit lens that came with your camera as well. So you use a wide aperture to let in the most amount of light into your camera, and when you zoom in, you use a wide aperture value to create depth of field. If you purposely going on a trip to do scenery pictures, you don't want any depth of field. When I do this kind of photography, I just set my camera to f8. And when you set your camera to f8, everything is great. Enough light comes into your camera, and there's no more depth of field. You get the flat auto mode look. And that's what you want for bright sunny days doing scenery pictures. So try doing this exercise at home. Stabilize your camera on a tabletop or tripod. Find a subject that's about 2 to 3 feet in front of you. And then you want to have a background that's at least 15 feet away from you. Zoom in your lens all the way. Then you want to focus on your subject and take a picture at a wide aperture, in this case 6.3. Then for the next photo, change your aperture value to f11 and then take another picture. Now try f16. And finally, f22. Then compare the 4 pictures yourself. Here's what the picture would look like if you had a prime lens. This way you can see for yourself what you've learned in this lesson. And it only takes about 3 hours of experience to get really good with aperture mode. And there is more you can learn later, but these are the basics. And most importantly, once you start shooting in aperture mode, you're off auto mode. And that's part of the excitement of getting the Canon M50. It only takes you a few minutes to get off auto mode. F8 only works great when it's a bright sunny day. As it starts getting darker or cloudier, you're probably going to have to start changing the f-stop value to something lower. When you use aperture mode, the camera is going to get the correct exposure most of the time. But when it doesn't, you do have a feature called exposure compensation. You can brighten or darken any image with the aperture value you chose. An exposure compensation only takes 5 minutes to learn. On the back of your camera, you're going to see this button. Once you press it, you're going to notice that the orange wheel on the back of your camera toggled over to this area. This is where you can change your exposure compensation. Now when you spin your command dial to the left, you're going to darken your image. And because the Canon M50 has exposure simulation built into the camera, you should see the back of your screen getting darker as you do this. Then when you spin your command dial back to 0, you're viewing the exposure the camera is going to take if you press the shutter button right now. If you spin your command dial to the right, you can brighten an image. For most of my photography, I never go past +1 or -1. So let's set our camera's exposure compensation to -1. Let's fire off a picture. Now let's change the exposure compensation back to 0 and take another picture. And finally, we'll set it to +1 and take yet another picture. In this example, you're going to see you have 3 different exposures using the same aperture value. So if you're out taking pictures and you find they're too dark, use exposure compensation to brighten the image. When you're out on a bright sunny day and there's snow or a lake, the exposure on your camera is often going to look overexposed. So when I'm shooting on days like this, I tend to just put my camera in exposure compensation and I just leave the exposure compensation at -2/3. That's how I get manual mode looking pictures even though I'm using aperture value. If I'm out shooting on a day where it just snowed and it's cloudy, oftentimes my snow looks blue or purple because it's underexposed. So sometimes on darker days I'll use exposure compensation and I'll leave the value at +1. When you're done with exposure compensation, you have to put it back to 0. And then when it's set, press the exposure compensation button once again to toggle back to the aperture value. When you turn your camera off and on, it does not reset the exposure compensation. That's why it's very important that you reset it every time. Once you've learned aperture mode, and then you start adding exposure compensation, you just learned mini manual mode. It's the same as manual mode, but instead of using a shutter speed to control the exposure, you're going to be choosing exposure compensation. So in about 3 hours of experience, you're already going to have learned over 95% of what you're going to use your camera for. That's why this camera is so special. Aperture mode is where you're going to get most of your pretty pictures, your scenery, your portraits, and your close-ups. But there's another semi-manual mode that's mostly known for getting really cool looking pictures. This is called time value. On your mode dial, look for where it says TV. When you're in time value, you're going to be setting the shutter speed and your camera is going to choose the aperture for you. Shutter speed is not just about getting the right exposure. It's also how you could be really creative. In the digital photography age, the only time people use shutter speed for cool pictures is to get these kind of waterfall shots, which we're going to cover later in this video. You can change the way the image looks just by changing the shutter speed, especially when things are moving. I use shutter mode pretty generously. So now that you're in time value mode, when you spin your command dial, you're going to notice these values change. Those are your shutter speeds. So if you need to freeze action, this is what you want to do when you're doing sporting events or taking pictures of pets or kids playing. You want to shoot in a fast shutter speed. So let's spin our command dial to the fastest shutter speed the Canon M50 will go. In this case, that's going to be 1/4000th of a second. If you're taking this lesson indoors, you're probably going to notice that at 1/4000th of a second, the back of your screen is probably going to be very dark. 1/4000th of a second is too fast for the lighting conditions you have right now, but this will work great when it's outdoors. So if you need to freeze action, you've got to use the fastest shutter speed you can use for the lighting that you have. So 1/4000th of a second outdoors is great, but if you're in a gymnasium, you might have to try 1/2000th of a second. If it's still too dark, try 1/1000th of a second, or even 1/500th of a second. Generally speaking, one of these fast shutter speeds should freeze the action. Most modern gymnasiums or hockey rinks, you should easily be able to shoot 1/1000th of a second to freeze action. Then if you use continuous mode, you can also shoot a fast shutter speed and get a whole bunch of images in 1 second. But sometimes when things are moving, you don't necessarily want to freeze the action. If you're taking pictures of cars going down the highway or someone riding their bike, you want to try shooting in middle shutter speeds. Not a lot of people purposely shoot in middle shutter speeds anymore. Here's what a car looks like going down the highway when you shoot fast. It looks like it's parked. Now here's what happens when we shoot 1/100th of a second. This is a middle shutter speed. Now there's a modest amount of motion and blur. Not everything needs to be tack sharp perfect. Sometimes the motion looks even better. So if you're going to be shooting joggers, cars, or even turbines, use a middle shutter speed. My favorite one is 1/100th of a second, but the range could be anywhere from about 1/50th to 1/200th of a second. It depends on how fast or slow your subject's moving. Here's an exaggerated version of what I'm talking about. Using middle shutter speeds can provoke the creative instinct in you. And I also use a middle shutter speed when I'm doing urban dark photography without a tripod, or if I'm going to be shooting a concert or an indoor party where it's dark. If you start shooting shutter speeds slower than 1/50th of a second, you're going to risk motion blur. Most people need a tripod to shoot anything slower than that. So let's spin our command dial to 1/100th of a second. Then you can start experimenting with your shutter speeds anytime you see something move. Take a whole series of pictures using different shutter speeds to kind of get the hang of it. It does take a little bit longer to learn than it does aperture mode, but it's so much more rewarding sometimes. Then if you want to take a picture of a waterfall, you're going to have to put your camera on a tripod and shoot 1 second. And you can't shoot a waterfall on a bright sunny day. Your image will be overexposed. Anything slower than 1/10th of a second won't work on bright sunny days. So let's pretend we're going to a waterfall right now, and it's cloudy out. Let's spin our command dial to the left, and we're going to watch those shutter speeds get slower and slower and slower. Once we start seeing the inches symbols, this means seconds. There's 3/10ths of a second, half a second, and then 1 inch means 1 second. Now when you press your shutter button, your camera's going to fire off the shutter for 1 full second. But it's not just for waterfalls. Using long shutter speeds is a lot of fun. That's why I made an entire video on night photography and using long shutter speeds in urban environments after dark. Once this video is done, you should check it out. Once you're done with time value mode, I like to always put my shutter speed back to 1/100th of a second so it's ready for next time I want to start shooting. Once you've learned aperture mode and then started playing with shutter speeds in time value mode, the transition to full manual mode will become natural one day. In manual mode, you're trying to balance the aperture with the shutter speed. And then you're also going to have to learn ISO. Or if you prefer, you could just keep shooting in semi-manual modes for most of your photography. That's what I do. Now we're going to finish off with lighting and composition. No matter how good or bad you are with your camera settings, lighting and composition is still the most important part. That's why for lighting, we don't want to waste stuff like great sunsets, cloudy days. Every day can give a different mood. You just don't want every single picture to look like it's shot in the middle of the day. That harsh light can look really bad on some subjects, but when you have that evenly diffused light, things can look just magical. You're using your camera settings to capture the light. And composition is the funnest part about photography. That's how you shoot things. There's composition rules like leading lines, rule of odds, rule of thirds. To help you with your composition and lighting, you have a feature on your camera called Monochrome Mode. This works while you're in aperture value, shutter mode, or manual mode. When you start shooting in monochrome mode, you're training your eye to see like a photographer, and it's easy. So let's put our camera in monochrome mode. Let's press the Q button. Now we're going to see our submenu. Let's go over to this value on the right side called Picture Style. Now I'm going to use my directional pad and go right and find Monochrome Mode. And I'm going to hit the Set button to lock that in. Now on the back of the camera, you're going to notice everything is black and white. Using Monochrome Mode, you're going to find it's really easy to find where the visual weight is. You're going to see textures, shapes, and patterns. These are the things that add so much value to your photos more than camera settings. So you can practice this around your house, or go out in the field and start shooting. Oftentimes what I do is I put my camera in monochrome mode, figure out how I want to shoot a subject, then I put my camera back to color. So I hit the Q button, go back to picture style, and I'm going to put it back to A for auto. Now I'm going to take my picture. Monochrome mode is sort of like a miracle trick, and very few people do this anymore. When you shoot in monochrome mode, sometimes the monochrome picture just looks better anyway. Here are a couple other tips about this camera you may want to consider. 1, you should get an extra battery. The battery on this camera does not last nearly as long as it did on my DSLR camera, so I usually carry at least 2 with me and sometimes 3. You should also consider getting one of these prime lenses. Canon makes a 22mm prime lens that works just great, and the aperture value is 2. And they also make a 50mm prime lens. The one I chose was this one made by Sigma. It's a 30mm prime lens. It's great for portraits or taking pictures of flowers. I put a link to all 3 of these lenses in the description below so you can choose the one that you like the best. Because this camera is so small and compact, I can easily fit this into my pocket. You're going to find that to be very useful because it's so portable. The biggest challenge for me when I bought this camera is that it took a little while to get used to the touchscreen. It's easy to accidentally change a setting and not know what you just did. But after a while I got used to it and now I don't make those mistakes anymore. But you will love using this camera. If you do have any questions or comments about this video, please leave it in the comment section below. And thank you so much for watching tonight.